When my only granddaughter celebrated her engagement party, I kept quiet about the $47 million I had inherited from her deceased father. They placed me at a folding table near the kitchen, where the catering staff bumped my chair every few minutes. I watched her raise champagne flutes, while her fiancé mentioned that I was simply the elderly woman who had looked after her growing up. That evening, they forgot to call me a taxi home. I didn't complain. I didn't make a scene. I simply smiled and waited. But what happens when the woman they dismissed as forgettable holds the keys to everything they desperately wanted? Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life family drama that will leave you speechless. The October morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn as I arrived at the Blue Ridge Country Club 3 hours before Charlotte's engagement party was scheduled to begin. Not because I was overeager or desperate for attention, but because I had volunteered to help arrange the centerpieces with Margaret, the wedding coordinator who had no earthly idea I was related to anyone attending this celebration. I simply wanted everything to be absolutely perfect for Charlotte's special day, the way I had wanted perfection for every important moment in her life since she was 7 years old. The mountains surrounding Asheville painted a breathtaking backdrop of gold and crimson leaves, nature's own celebration of the changing season. Round tables dotted the club's expansive terrace, each one draped in ivory linens so pristine they seemed to glow in the morning light. Burgundy roses arranged in crystal vases caught the sunlight, casting delicate shadows across each carefully planned place setting. Every guest would have a designated seat, every detail orchestrated to create lasting memories. Every person would know exactly where they belonged in Charlotte's new life story, except me. Margaret, a petite woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in an efficient bun, handed me a clipboard and smiled warmly. "Mrs. Patterson, thank you so much for helping with the flowers. The bride mentioned you have experience with event planning?" I didn't correct her assumption about my identity or my connection to the bride. Instead, I nodded and began arranging roses with the practiced hands of someone who had spent countless evenings helping Charlotte with school projects, birthday parties, and every celebration that had mattered to her over the past 18 years. As we worked together, Margaret chatted about her other events, the challenges of outdoor receptions, and the particular requests Charlotte and her fiancé had made for their party. She mentioned how specific they had been about seating arrangements, how certain they were about which family members should sit where, how important it was that everything reflect their sophisticated tastes. "The bride seems lovely," Margaret said, adjusting a rose that had drooped slightly. "Very organized, very clear about her vision. She mentioned this party means everything to her, because it is bringing together all the people who have shaped her into the woman she is today." I smiled and continued arranging flowers, wondering if Charlotte had mentioned the woman who had packed her lunch every school day for 11 years, who had driven her to dance lessons twice a week, who had held her hair back when she was sick with food poisoning after her 16th birthday party. When the hostess station opened at noon, I approached the young woman in the navy dress who was reviewing her master guest list. She squinted at her clipboard, flipped through several pages with increasing confusion, then looked up at me with the polite but strained smile service workers, perfect when dealing with problems they didn't create. "I am sorry." "What was the last name again, Mitchell?" I said clearly. "Dorothy Mitchell." She flipped through the pages again, running her finger down column after column of carefully printed names. Her forehead creased with concentration as she double-checked, triple-checked, then looked up with barely concealed frustration. "I am not seeing you on the main list. Are you sure you RSVP had? Sometimes people forget, and then we have issues with seating." I assured her that Charlotte had specifically invited me, that there might have been some oversight with the formal invitations. The hostess sighed and gestured vaguely toward the service area, where metal folding chairs were stacked against the wall. "There is an extra chair by the coffee station," she said, already turning her attention to the next guest who had arrived behind me. "I am sure we can find you a spot somewhere." I settled into the cold metal folding chair without protest, smoothing my best blue dress and adjusting my purse strap across my shoulder. Sometimes dignity speaks louder than demands, and I had learned over 73 years that making a scene rarely changes people's hearts, only their behavior. From my position behind a decorative column wrapped in ivy and fairy lights, I had a perfect view of the ceremony area, but remained essentially invisible to the arriving guests. I watched Charlotte's future-in-laws claim their prominent seats in the front row, resplendent in their designer clothing and confident smiles. I observed the parade of college friends, young professionals with their perfectly styled hair and expensive accessories, all chattering excitedly about Charlotte's good fortune and bright future. Charlotte herself appeared at 12:30, radiant in a flowing champagne-colored dress that complemented her auburn hair beautifully. She wore her grandmother's vintage pearl necklace, the one her father had saved specifically for this kind of occasion. My heart swelled watching her float across the terrace, greeting guests with genuine warmth and excitement. She was beautiful, poised, everything I had hoped she would become when she was just a frightened little girl who had lost her parents in that terrible winter storm 18 years ago. Marcus, her fiancé, stood beside the ornate floral archway in a perfectly tailored navy suit. He was handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way that parents dream about for their daughters. Tall, athletic, with the kind of confident smile that suggested he had never encountered a problem money and charm couldn't solve. He worked at a prestigious investment firm in Charlotte, made excellent money, and treated Charlotte like a princess. What more could an old grandmother want for the child she had raised? As the ceremony began, I found myself remembering all the moments that had led to this celebration. Charlotte at 7, crying in my arms after the funeral, asking why God had taken her mommy and daddy away. Charlotte at 12, nervous about her first school dance, practicing her conversation skills in front of my bedroom mirror. Charlotte at 16, angry and rebellious, screaming that I wasn't her real mother and couldn't tell her what to do. Charlotte at 18, crying different tears as she left for college, thanking me for everything I had sacrificed to raise her. Those memories made the current moment both beautiful and heartbreaking. Beautiful because she had grown into such a remarkable young woman. Heartbreaking because somewhere along the way, I would apparently become invisible in her story. When the minister asked the traditional question about who gives this woman in marriage, Charlotte's eyes swept across the front row where Marcus's parents sat beaming with pride and joy. She paused, smiled radiantly at her college roommate Sarah, who had flown in from Seattle specifically for this celebration, then nodded gracefully toward the photographer to continue with the ceremony. No glance toward the back corner where I sat behind the decorative column. No acknowledgement of the woman who would legally adopted her, who had been both mother and father for more than half her life, who had worked double shifts at the accounting firm to pay for her private school education. During the ring exchange, I thought about Richard's hands placing that same ring on my finger 47 years ago. He had been nervous, fumbling with the small velvet box, apologizing for choosing something less expensive than I deserved. I had told him then that the size of the diamond mattered far less than the size of the love behind it. Richard would have loved seeing his daughter so happy, so confident, so surrounded by people who clearly adored her. He also would have been devastated to see me relegated to the shadows of her celebration. The reception toasts began immediately after the ceremony concluded. Marcus's father, a distinguished man with silver hair and an expensive watch, spoke eloquently about welcoming Charlotte into their family. He praised her intelligence, her ambition, her grace under pressure. He mentioned how proud Richard would have been to see his daughter marrying into such a loving, supportive family. Charlotte's college roommate Sarah gave a hilarious speech about their adventures in sorority life, complete with embarrassing stories that made everyone laugh and cry simultaneously. She talked about Charlotte's loyalty, her generosity with friends, her ability to light up any room she entered. Marcus's best man, a colleague from the investment firm, toasted the couple's bright future, their shared goals, their commitment to building something beautiful together. He joked about Marcus finally finding someone smart enough to keep him in line, about Charlotte being brave enough to take on such a challenging project. When Marcus himself took the microphone, his voice was thick with emotion as he thanked everyone who had shaped him into the man he was today. He named his coaches from high school and college, his fraternity brothers who had supported him through difficult times, his parents for their unwavering belief in his potential. He thanked Charlotte's college mentor, who had helped her land her first job at the marketing firm. He even thanked his grandmother's poodle, Princess, for teaching him patience and unconditional love. The crowd erupted in laughter and applause. Charlotte giggled and reached for the microphone to add her own gratitude list. She thanked Sarah for being the sister she had never had, Marcus's parents for welcoming her so warmly into their family, her sorority sisters for showing her what true friendship looked like, her boss at the marketing firm for giving her time off to plan this celebration. She raised her champagne glass high and scanned the room with sparkling eyes before declaring, "To everyone who made us who we are today, your love and support mean everything to us." The applause was thunderous, genuine, full of the kind of warmth that makes celebrations memorable. I clapped along enthusiastically, smiling genuinely despite the hollow feeling that was expanding steadily in my chest, like a balloon filled with cold air. As the evening progressed, I made myself useful in the way elderly women often do at large gatherings. I helped stack empty champagne glasses when the servers got overwhelmed. I folded abandoned cocktail napkins and returned them to the appropriate stations. I assisted elderly guests who needed help navigating the terrace steps in their formal shoes. No one questioned why the woman in the simple blue dress was clearing tables and refilling water glasses. Invisible people often become useful by default, and usefulness can provide its own kind of dignity when recognition is absent. Near the end of the evening, as the band played soft jazz standards and couples swayed together under the string lights, I approached Charlotte to say goodbye. She was laughing with her bridesmaids, all of them glowing with champagne and happiness, their heels kicked off under the table as they shared gossip and wedding planning advice. "Charlotte, sweetheart," I said quietly, touching her shoulder gently. She turned with that radiant smile, the one that had melted my heart countless times over the years. "Grandma Dorothy, are you having a wonderful time?" "Isn't everything just perfect?" I assured her that the party was absolutely beautiful, that she looked stunning, that Marcus seemed like a wonderful young man. I kissed her soft cheek and whispered congratulations, breathing in the expensive perfume she had chosen for her special day. "Thank you so much for coming," she said, already turning back to her friends. "Drive safely." I gathered my small purse and light jacket, nodding goodbye to Margaret, who was directing the cleanup crew with military precision. As I walked slowly toward the parking area, I could hear the laughter and music continuing behind me, the celebration carrying on without missing a beat. The drive home to my small brick house in West Asheville took 45 minutes through winding mountain roads that I had traveled thousands of times over the years. Roads I had driven when rushing Charlotte to emergency rooms for broken bones and high fevers. Roads I had navigated during snowstorms to attend her school plays and basketball games. Roads that had become as familiar as the lines on my own hands. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, not from anxiety about the driving, but from the fundamental need to feel grounded when everything else felt uncertain. The tears came quietly as I passed familiar landmarks: the elementary school, where Charlotte had learned to read; the ice cream shop, where we had celebrated her good report cards; the church where we had attended services together every Sunday for 11 years. These were the kind of tears that leave your throat tight and your chest aching, but don't make your eyes swell dramatically. The kind of tears that come from deep disappointment rather than acute grief. The kind that whisper rather than scream. If you have ever loved someone completely, sacrificed years of your own dreams to support theirs, only to realize you have somehow become background noise in their success story, you might understand that particular brand of heartache. It cuts deep and leaves no visible wounds, no dramatic scars that justify the pain or demand sympathy from others. It simply settles into your bones like arthritis, a dull ache that becomes part of your daily reality. I had no idea that crisp October evening that something far worse than emotional neglect was waiting for me in a manila folder that would appear on my kitchen counter just 4 days later. Something with my signature perfectly forged in blue ink. Something that would transform disappointment into determination and heartache into justice. 4 days after the engagement party, Charlotte called while I was tending my small herb garden, deadheading the last of the season's basil and oregano plants. Her voice carried that particular tone she had developed since starting her job at the marketing firm Professional. Efficient, slightly distant. Grandma Dorothy, I hope you are feeling well. Marcus and I were wondering if you could join us for brunch this Sunday at our new apartment. There are some family matters we would like to discuss with you. Family matters. The phrase struck me as oddly formal, especially coming from someone who usually communicated through quick text messages and occasional phone calls that lasted less than 5 minutes. I told her I would be delighted to join them, asked if I should bring anything special. She assured me that everything was already planned, that I should just bring myself and maybe that wisdom she had always admired in me. The compliment felt both genuine and strategic, though I couldn't quite identify why. Their modern loft occupied the top floor of a converted textile mill in downtown Asheville, all exposed brick walls and industrial fixtures that had been softened with expensive furniture and carefully curated artwork. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the French Broad River wound between autumn hills like a silver ribbon, reflecting the October sky in shades of blue and gray. Marcus answered the door, wearing a burgundy cashmere sweater that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. He offered a firm handshake and that confident smile that had charmed everyone at the engagement party, guiding me toward the kitchen with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to hosting important meetings. Mrs. Mitchell, thank you so much for coming. Can I get you some coffee? Charlotte just finished making those blueberry scones you mentioned loving. The kitchen island was larger than my entire dining room. All black granite and stainless steel appliances that gleamed under modern pendant lights. Charlotte appeared from behind the massive refrigerator wearing a flowing beige outfit that looked effortlessly expensive. The kind of clothing featured in lifestyle magazines and Instagram posts. Grandma Dorothy, she exclaimed, though her smile seemed slightly rehearsed, as if she had been practicing the appropriate level of enthusiasm. I made those blueberry scones with fresh berries from the farmer's market. I remembered how much you enjoyed them when I made them in high school. I would brought homemade apple butter in a mason jar, the way Richard's mother had taught me decades ago. The jar looked humble and old-fashioned beside the artisanal cheese board and imported coffee they had arranged on the granite countertop. Neither of them acknowledged my contribution to the meal, though they arranged it politely among the other offerings, without comment. Marcus poured himself coffee from a sleek espresso machine, while Charlotte arranged fresh flowers in a crystal vase that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. Everything about their apartment spoke of success, sophistication, and a lifestyle that required significant financial resources. We have been thinking about the future lately, Charlotte began, perching gracefully on one of the modern bar stools that surrounded the kitchen island. Marcus and I want to start our family soon, and we realized we should probably get more organized about financial planning. She gestured toward a thick leather folder bearing the embossed logo of Mitchell and Associates, a downtown law firm I recognized from their television advertisements. The folder looked expensive, official, intimidating in the way legal documents often do when presented to people who aren't familiar with their language and implications. I kept my hands folded in my lap, maintaining the patient posture I had perfected during 40 years of accounting work. What kind of financial planning are you considering? Marcus cleared his throat delicately, setting his coffee cup down with careful precision. Well, with your age and everything, we thought it might be easier if Charlotte and I could handle some of the more complicated financial decisions. You know, investment, management, tax planning, estate organization, that sort of thing. He spoke carefully, using the tone people employ when explaining something to elderly relatives they believe might not understand complex concepts. The tone suggested concern, respect, and gentle condescension, all wrapped together in a package designed to seem helpful rather than controlling. Charlotte opened the leather folder with flourish, revealing several documents printed on heavy cream-colored paper. It is really just paperwork, Grandma. You had still be involved in everything important, but more in an advisory capacity. The lawyer explained that it would reduce stress for you while ensuring everything gets handled properly. The top page read, Estate Management Transfer Agreement, in elegant script lettering. Having worked as a bookkeeper for 37 years before retirement, I was familiar with legal language and document formatting. This particular agreement was polished and professional, but something about their presentation felt rehearsed, as if they had practiced this conversation multiple times. I flipped through the pages slowly, scanning signatures, notary stamps, and witness acknowledgments. The language was clean and corporate, but perhaps a bit too smooth, a little too practiced for a standard estate planning document. On page 4, my stomach dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. There was my signature at the bottom of a document I had never seen before. The handwriting was precise, matching perfectly the way I signed birthday cards, bank deposit slips, and Christmas presents. Every loop and curve was identical to my natural writing style. From the distinctive way I crossed my T's to the particular flourish I added to the final letter of my last name. But I had never held the pen that created those loops and curves. I stared at the signature line for what felt like several minutes, though it was probably only seconds. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. The casual conversation continuing around me seemed to be happening underwater, muffled and distant. "This signature," I said quietly, pointing to the bottom of page 4 with a finger that I hoped wasn't visibly trembling. "When did I supposedly sign this document?" Charlotte glanced over with the casual interest of someone checking the time. "Oh, that is from last month when we met with Mr. Mitchell at his office downtown. Remember? You said you needed time to review everything before making final decisions." I had never met with any Mr. Mitchell. I had never been to any law office downtown. I had never signed any document transferring control of assets that Charlotte and Marcus weren't even supposed to know existed. The realization hit me like cold water. Someone had practiced my handwriting well enough to forge my signature convincingly. Someone had planned this deception carefully, methodically, with the kind of attention to detail that suggested significant preparation and intent. I closed the folder gently and placed both hands on top of it, using the physical contact to ground myself in reality. "I need to take this home and read through everything very carefully." "Of course," Marcus said quickly, his voice carrying just the right note of understanding patience. "Take all the time you need. We just want what is best for everyone in the family." Charlotte nodded enthusiastically. "There is no pressure at all, Grandma. We know legal documents can be overwhelming. The important thing is that we are all working together to protect the family's future." On the drive home, my mind kept circling back to that signature, identical to mine in every detail except for one crucial fact: I hadn't written it. The implications were staggering, terrifying, and infuriating all at once. By the time I reached my small brick house with its familiar blue shutters and well-tended garden, confusion had transformed into something sharper and more focused. Not the explosive kind of anger that burns hot and fades quickly, but the steady, determined kind that plans carefully and acts with precision. That evening, I sat at my dining room table with a magnifying glass I had used for detailed accounting work, examining every page of the documents they had given me. The forged signature appeared on 3 separate pages, each supposedly witnessed and notarized on dates when I had been nowhere near a lawyer's office. Someone had studied my handwriting extensively. Someone had practiced replicating my signature until they could reproduce it flawlessly. Someone had planned this deception with the kind of calculated precision that suggested they understood exactly what they were attempting to steal. And that someone was my granddaughter, the child I had sacrificed everything to raise with love, patience, and unwavering devotion. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I made lists with the methodical attention to detail that had served me well during decades of accounting work. Dates when I was supposedly signing documents versus detailed records of where I actually was. Phone calls from Charlotte over the past few months that suddenly made more sense in this new context. Recent questions about my health, my memory, my ability to manage daily tasks, questions that had seemed like natural concern but now felt like preparation for a narrative about my declining competency. Around 3 in the morning, I remembered the safety deposit box. Richard had insisted I rent it at First National Bank after the car accident, when suddenly I was responsible for Charlotte's entire future and needed secure storage for important documents. Inside that small metal drawer were the original estate papers: the will, the trust documents, and a sealed envelope he had left with very specific instructions. Only open this if something goes wrong. He had said during those dark months, when we were both still reeling from grief and trying to figure out how to raise a traumatized child. If people try to take advantage of you or Charlotte, if family starts fighting over money instead of focusing on what really matters. At the time, I had thought he was being overly cautious, perhaps even paranoid. Richard had always been a planner, someone who anticipated worst-case scenarios, because his work in insurance had shown him how quickly families could dissolve into conflict when significant money was involved. Now his caution seemed prescient, possibly life-saving. The next morning, I drove to First National Bank and requested access to the safety deposit box I hadn't opened in more than 15 years. The bank employee, a young woman with kind eyes and efficient mannerisms, led me to the private viewing room and left me alone with the metal drawer that contained Richard's final protections. My hands shook slightly as I broke the wax seal he had pressed with his college ring, the one that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. Inside the envelope were copies of the true trust documents and a letter written in Richard's familiar handwriting, the same careful script he had used for grocery lists and birthday cards. Dorothy, if you are reading this, someone has probably tried to manipulate or steal the estate. The real trust is more complicated than Charlotte knows, and it is designed to protect both of you from exactly this kind of situation. You have complete control until she turns 35 and demonstrates genuine responsibility, character, and gratitude. The money isn't automatically hers just because I am gone. It has to be earned through behavior, not simply inherited through biology. Protect yourself first. She will understand eventually, or she will not. Either way, the choice and the power belong to you alone. I stared at that letter for 20 minutes, reading and rereading every word. Richard had known this might happen. Somehow, he had anticipated that grief, time, and the influence of money might change his daughter in ways we couldn't predict when she was just a frightened 7-year-old girl. According to the original trust documents, Charlotte wouldn't gain access to her inheritance for another 8 years. And even then, only if I, as sole trustee, believed she had demonstrated the values Richard considered essential: humility, gratitude, genuine concern for others, and respect for the people who had sacrificed to help her succeed. The papers Marcus and Charlotte had shown me weren't just forgeries. They were an attempt to steal an inheritance that wasn't even legally available yet, using lies and manipulation against the very person who had made their comfortable lives possible. I drove home slowly, taking the scenic route through the mountains where the leaves were turning brilliant shades of red, gold, and orange. Everything looked exactly the same as it had yesterday morning: the familiar curves of the road, the small farmhouses dotting the hillsides, the gentle mountains that had surrounded my entire adult life. But something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of the world and my place in it. For the first time since Charlotte's engagement party, I wasn't sad about being forgotten or dismissed. I was angry, and not the helpless kind of anger that comes from powerlessness. This was the focused, determined kind of anger that comes from discovering you have more strength and options than you had realized. That afternoon, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 5 years. Eleanor Hartwell had been Richard's attorney when he established the trust after Charlotte's parents died. She had handled the adoption paperwork, managed the insurance settlements, and helped us navigate the legal complexities of suddenly becoming guardians to a traumatized child. Eleanor had retired from active practice after her second husband passed away, moving to a small organic farm outside Hendersonville, where she raised heritage vegetables, restored antique furniture, and taught financial literacy classes at the community college. But her legal mind remained sharp as a surgical blade, and her integrity was beyond question. "Dorothy Mitchell," she said warmly when she recognized my voice. "What a lovely surprise. How are you holding up?" "How is Charlotte doing these days?" I explained the situation methodically. The way I had learned to present financial discrepancies during my accounting career. The forged documents, the impossible meeting dates, the signatures I had never written. The inheritance Charlotte wasn't supposed to know existed. Eleanor listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of concern or disapproval. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Dorothy, this is document fraud on multiple levels. You could press criminal charges that would result in serious consequences for both Charlotte and her fiancé. This isn't a minor deception or family disagreement. This is felony-level financial crime. What are my other options? Eleanor paused, considering. You could use what you know to educate them quietly, without involving law enforcement. File a formal complaint with the State Bar Association. Freeze the assets temporarily while demanding a full explanation. Document everything and build a stronger case before taking action. She hesitated. Or you could let them dig themselves deeper before confronting them with the evidence. I asked what she meant by that last option. People who forge documents once usually try again when their first attempt fails, especially if they think their victim is vulnerable or easily manipulated. If you give them enough rope and enough time, they might provide you with even more evidence of their criminal intent and their willingness to exploit your trust. That evening, I sat in my small garden with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sun set behind the familiar mountains and breathing in the crisp October air. The garden that Charlotte had helped me plant as a child, where she had learned to identify herbs and vegetables, where we had spent countless peaceful hours working together in comfortable silence. I thought about Charlotte as a little girl, how she used to help me plant tomato seedlings each spring and insisted on naming each plant something different, how she had crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, trusting me completely to keep her safe from the thunder and lightning that terrified her. Somewhere along the way, that trust had curdled into something else entirely. The woman who had forged my signature wasn't the child I had raised with such love and hope. She was someone else, someone I was only beginning to understand and certainly didn't recognize. I didn't want revenge in the dramatic sense, but I wanted clarity. I wanted to understand how far they were willing to go, how many lies they were prepared to tell, how much of my love and sacrifice they were willing to exploit for financial gain. Most importantly, I wanted to know if the Charlotte I had raised was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the greed and manipulation, or if she was truly lost to me forever. So I decided to wait, watch, and let them reveal their true intentions through their own choices and actions. 2 weeks later, Charlotte called again, while I was preparing lunch in my small kitchen. This time her voice carried more urgency, less of the casual confidence she had displayed during our brunch meeting. Grandma Dorothy, I hope you are doing well. Did you have a chance to review those papers we discussed? The financial advisor mentioned that he needs them back by Friday because of some important deadlines. I told her I was still reading through everything carefully, that legal documents required thorough consideration, especially when they involved significant decisions. She laughed nervously and said she understood completely, but emphasized that time was somewhat important because of tax deadlines and investment opportunities. There were no tax deadlines in November that would affect a private trust. I had done enough bookkeeping and estate work to know the IRS calendar by heart, and nothing about their timeline made legal sense. Why don't you and Marcus come by Saturday afternoon? I suggested casually. We can go through everything together, and you can explain the parts that seem confusing to me. They arrived at my house precisely at 2 o'clock, both dressed more formally than the occasion required. Charlotte wore a tailored black dress that looked expensive and professional. Marcus carried a leather briefcase and wore his most charming smile, as if he were attending an important business meeting rather than visiting his fiancé's elderly grandmother. I had prepared for their visit by hiding a small digital recorder in the fruit bowl on my kitchen counter, positioning it to capture our conversation clearly. Richard had used similar recording devices during important meetings at the insurance office, always informing people that their discussions were being documented for accuracy and legal protection. Today, I decided to keep the recording private until I better understood their intentions. We sat at my dining room table, the same spot where I had helped Charlotte with homework assignments for 10 years, where we had celebrated her good grades and worked through her academic challenges together. The autumn light streaming through the windows made everything look warm and golden, but the atmosphere felt cold and calculated in a way that would have been unimaginable just a few months ago. Charlotte spread the documents across the polished wood surface again, but this time she had added several new pages to the collection. Each one required my signature in multiple places. Each one transferred increasing levels of control to her and Marcus, reducing my role from active trustee to passive figurehead. The advisor made a few updates, she explained with practiced casualness, just to make sure everything's properly organized and legally sound. He said the original documents we showed you were missing some important protections. I examined the new pages methodically, using the reading glasses I had worn for accounting work to study every detail. My forged signature appeared on documents supposedly signed just 3 days earlier. During meetings I had never attended with witnesses I would never met. The precision was remarkable and deeply disturbing. Someone had not only studied my handwriting extensively, but had also created false legal scenarios complete with fake witnesses and fabricated meeting records. "This is very interesting," I said calmly, pointing to one of the signature lines. "According to this document, I signed these papers Wednesday afternoon at 2:30. "That is right," Marcus confirmed smoothly. "At Mr. Mitchell's office downtown. We discussed the changes, and you seemed comfortable with everything." I nodded slowly, maintaining a pleasant expression. "That is absolutely fascinating, because Wednesday afternoon I was at Dr. Peterson's office having a root canal procedure that lasted 3 hours. I have the receipt right here, complete with timestamps and procedure codes." I pulled out the dental bill I had retrieved from my medical files, along with the prescription receipt for pain medication and the follow-up appointment card. The documentation was thorough and impossible to dispute. Charlotte's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks like water from a broken cup. Marcus cleared his throat several times and mumbled something about possible date confusion or clerical errors at the law office. "Oh, there is no confusion," I said pleasantly, maintaining the gentle tone I had used when correcting Charlotte's homework mistakes years ago. "I am quite certain about where I was Wednesday afternoon, because my mouth was still numb when I got home that evening." Dr. Peterson had to drill very deep, and the Novocaine took hours to wear off. It is the kind of discomfort you don't forget easily. The silence that followed stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Finally, Charlotte attempted a laugh, but it came out brittle and forced. "Well, mistakes happen in legal offices all the time. The important thing is getting everything sorted out properly for the family's future." I leaned back in my chair and asked her to explain exactly what needed sorting in our family's future. She launched into a rehearsed speech about investment opportunities, tax advantages, and modernizing outdated financial structures that were supposedly holding back our family's wealth. Marcus nodded along attentively, occasionally adding phrases like optimized returns, strategic positioning, and comprehensive portfolio management. Neither of them mentioned the word inheritance directly. Neither acknowledged that this entire discussion involved money I would never told them existed. They were planning to steal something they weren't supposed to know about, using forged documents and fabricated legal meetings. The audacity was breathtaking. When they finished their presentation, I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen, using the movement to give myself time to process the full scope of their deception. I poured 3 glasses of sweet tea from the pitcher I always kept in the refrigerator, adding ice cubes and lemon slices the way Charlotte had always preferred. Returning to the table, I set a glass in front of each of them and settled back into my chair. "Charlotte," I said quietly, "do you remember when you were 12 years old and you took $20 from my purse to buy that expensive makeup kit you had seen at the mall?" She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, glancing at Marcus for support. "Grandma, I don't see what that has to do with you. Thought I hadn't noticed the missing money." I continued gently. "But I had noticed. Immediately, I waited to see if you would confess on your own, if you would apologize and return what you had taken. But you never did." Marcus was studying his hands with apparent fascination, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "So I sat you down at this very table and talked to you about honesty, about trust, about how lying and stealing hurt the people who love you most. Do you remember what you said to me that day?" Charlotte's professional mask was beginning to slip, revealing the uncertainty beneath her confident exterior. "Not really? No. You promised me you had never lie to me again. You said you understood that trust was the most important thing in any relationship, and that you would rather disappoint me with truth than hurt me with lies. I sipped my tea and let that memory settle between us. This situation feels remarkably familiar, except now instead of $20, we are discussing documents with my forged signature. Instead of a makeup kit, we are talking about assets you have no legal claim to. Instead of a confused 12-year-old, I am dealing with adults who have planned this deception carefully and deliberately. Charlotte's eyes flashed with anger, her composure finally cracking under the pressure. What assets? What are you talking about? We don't know anything about hidden money or secret accounts. I almost smiled at her performance, the way she had managed to sound both indignant and confused simultaneously. That is a fascinating response, Charlotte. If you don't know about any assets, why are you asking me to sign papers transferring control of them to you? The logical trap was so obvious that even Marcus seemed to recognize it. He placed his hand on Charlotte's arm, probably trying to signal her to stop talking, but she shook him off irritably. Look, Grandma, we know Dad left you something when he died. We are not stupid, and we are not trying to steal anything. We just think it makes sense for the family to manage financial matters together, instead of leaving everything to someone your age who might not understand modern investment strategies. There it was. The truth beneath all the professional language and forged signatures and fabricated legal meetings. I nodded slowly, acknowledging her honesty. I see. And you thought the best way to manage family assets together was to forge my signature on legal documents without my knowledge or consent. We didn't forge anything, Charlotte snapped, her voice rising for the first time. You are confused about dates and meetings. You are getting older, and your memory isn't what it used to be. Maybe you signed those papers and just don't remember. Marcus actually winced at her words. Even he seemed to recognize that accusing an elderly woman of memory problems while simultaneously attempting to steal her assets was both tactically stupid and morally reprehensible. I stood up again. This time walking to the kitchen drawer where I kept important papers and emergency contact information. I returned with a manila folder and placed it carefully on the table. You are absolutely right that I am getting older, I said calmly. But my memory remains quite clear. Clear enough to remember that I never signed your documents. Clear enough to remember the original trust terms your father established after your parents died. And clear enough to remember that you will not have access to any inheritance until you are 35 years old. I opened the folder and showed them copies of the real estate documents, the ones Eleanor had helped me photocopy and notarize that morning. Clear enough to remember that even when you reach 35, distribution of assets depends entirely on my assessment of your character, your values, and your treatment of the people who have sacrificed to help you succeed. Charlotte stared at the papers, spread before her, her face cycling rapidly through confusion, realization, and pure fury. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor, possibly into another dimension where he would never met either of us. Those documents are fake, Charlotte said finally, her voice tight with desperation. You are trying to trick us, to manipulate us into giving up what is rightfully ours. I pulled out my phone and showed them the photographs I had taken at the bank that morning. Clear images of the safety deposit box contents, with timestamps and location data embedded in the metadata. These are certified copies from the safety deposit box, your father established specifically for this purpose. The box you don't have access to. The one that contains his original instructions about how the inheritance should be handled, and what conditions must be met before any money changes hands. The recording device in the fruit bowl captured every word of the 25-minute argument that followed. Charlotte accused me of lying, of hiding assets that belonged to her, of being a bitter old woman who couldn't stand to see young people happy and successful. Marcus tried repeatedly to play peacemaker, suggesting there must be some misunderstanding that lawyers could resolve, that families shouldn't fight over money when love was more important than financial gain. I let them vent their frustration and reveal their true priorities when they finally exhausted themselves. When the accusations stopped flying and the silence became uncomfortable, I spoke quietly. I think you should leave now. When you are ready to have an honest conversation about respect, responsibility, and the difference between earning something and simply expecting it, you know where to find me. They gathered their forged documents with as much dignity as they could muster and left without saying goodbye. Through my kitchen window, I watched them argue in their expensive car for several minutes before driving away, probably debating their next move and trying to figure out how their careful plan had unraveled so completely. That evening, I called Eleanor and described the entire encounter in detail. She listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific statements they had made or documents they had presented. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before responding. "Dorothy, you now have recorded evidence of their knowledge about the forged signatures, their attempts to manipulate you into signing additional fraudulent documents, and their efforts to gaslight you about your own memory and competency. This is more than enough for serious criminal charges if you choose to pursue them." What would those charges mean for Charlotte? Eleanor explained that document forgery, especially involving substantial assets, carried serious penalties, including potential jail time, hefty fines, and permanent criminal records that would affect employment, housing, and professional licensing opportunities. "But you have other options," she continued. "You could use this evidence to demand accountability without involving the criminal justice system. You could impose consequences through the trust itself, using the powers Richard gave you to protect both the assets and the family's integrity." Over the next few days, I organized my evidence with the methodical precision I had learned during decades of accounting work. The original trust documents, copies of the forged papers, the recording of our confrontation, receipts and medical records proving I was elsewhere when I supposedly signed fraudulent documents. But more importantly, I started thinking carefully about what Richard would have wanted in this situation. What kind of consequences would actually teach valuable lessons rather than simply punish bad behavior? He had established the trust because he understood that inherited wealth could either build character or destroy it. Money could teach responsibility and humility, or it could enable entitlement and selfishness. The outcome depended entirely on how inheritance was handled, what expectations were established, and what values were reinforced through the process. Charlotte had failed his test spectacularly, but that didn't necessarily mean she was beyond redemption. The question was whether failure would lead to learning and growth, or simply to more sophisticated forms of manipulation and entitlement. 2 weeks passed without any contact from Charlotte or Marcus. Then I received a thick envelope delivered by certified mail, requiring my signature and creating an official record of delivery. Inside was a formal letter from Patterson, Burke & Associates, a law firm I had never heard of, demanding immediate release of estate assets and questioning my mental competency to serve as trustee. The letter was professionally written and legally intimidating, but it was based entirely on the forged documents Charlotte and Marcus had created. It threatened immediate legal action if I didn't comply with their demands within 10 business days. I called Eleanor immediately. After reviewing the letter, she started laughing with genuine amusement. "Dorothy, they have just provided us with additional evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud. This letter references the forged signatures as if they were legitimate legal documents. It also suggests they have involved other people in their scheme, including attorneys who could lose their licenses for participating in document fraud." She explained that any law firm would be required to verify the authenticity of documents before filing formal complaints or making legal threats. When they discovered the forgeries, they would either immediately withdraw from the case or become unwilling witnesses to Charlotte and Marcus's criminal behavior. Eleanor asked. I thought about Richard's letter, about the difference between punishment and education, about the possibility of redemption even after serious mistakes. "I want to give them one final opportunity to do the right thing," I said. "After that, we pursue criminal charges and let the legal system handle the consequences." Eleanor drafted a response letter that was both professionally polite and legally devastating. It explained that the documents in question contained forged signatures, that criminal complaints had been filed with local law enforcement, and that any further harassment would be considered witness intimidation. We sent copies to Charlotte, Marcus, and their attorney, creating an official record of our position and their criminal exposure. The response was swift and dramatic. Charlotte called that evening, sobbing hysterically and claiming she had been manipulated by Marcus, pressured by financial stress, and confused about legal technicalities she didn't understand. She begged for forgiveness and promised to make everything right if I would just give her another chance. I listened patiently to her 20-minute confession, then asked her a simple question. If you were truly sorry, Charlotte, what would you do to demonstrate that your remorse is genuine rather than simply fear of consequences? She said she would return all the forged documents, break up with Marcus immediately, and never mention the inheritance again. That would be a start, I said carefully, but sorry isn't enough anymore. Trust has to be rebuilt through consistent actions over time, not just words during crisis moments. I told her I was establishing a foundation with a significant portion of the estate, dedicated to protecting elderly people from financial abuse and family exploitation. If she wanted to be part of our family again, she could begin by volunteering her time and professional skills to help other families avoid the trauma ours had experienced. She was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications. Then she asked the question that told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. How much money would be left for my inheritance? The amount depends entirely on the person you choose to become over the next several years, I said. Your father designed the trust to reward character development, not just biological relationships. 6 months later, I received an elegant wedding invitation printed on expensive paper. Charlotte was marrying Marcus after all, despite her tearful promises to end their relationship. The ceremony would be held at the Grove Park Inn, one of Asheville's most prestigious venues. My name appeared on the guest list, but I wasn't invited to participate in the ceremony in any meaningful way. No special seating, no acknowledgement in the program, no role in the celebration beyond filling a chair in the back rows. I declined politely and sent a modest wedding gift, a set of kitchen towels, and a card wishing them happiness in their new life together. Instead of attending their wedding, I spent that weekend working on the foundation's first annual report and visiting Eleanor's farm to help harvest her late-season vegetables. We talked about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, about protecting yourself while still hoping for the best in people who have hurt you. The foundation I had established was already making a real difference in people's lives. We had helped 18 families navigate inheritance disputes, provided legal assistance to 12 elderly victims of financial abuse, and created a support network for people who felt forgotten and exploited by their own relatives. Every person we assisted reminded me that my experience with Charlotte wasn't unique or even unusual. Families across the country struggled with the same tensions between love and money, respect and entitlement, sacrifice and recognition. The work gave meaning to my pain and purpose to the betrayal I had experienced. Instead of simply being a victim of family exploitation, I would become an advocate for others facing similar challenges. A year after Charlotte's wedding, I received a brief Christmas card with a generic holiday message and both their signatures printed in gold ink. No personal note, no acknowledgement of our shared history, no expression of regret for the damage they had caused to our relationship. I added it to a scrapbook I had started, not out of sentimental attachment, but as a reminder of the journey I had traveled from silent victim to empowered advocate for vulnerable people. The foundation continued growing steadily, funded by careful investment of Richard's inheritance and supported by volunteers who understood firsthand how financial betrayal could destroy family relationships. We opened a second office in Raleigh and hired 5 full-time staff members, all of whom had personal experience with elder abuse or inheritance manipulation. Charlotte never volunteered her time as I had suggested. She never asked about the foundation's work or offered to help other families avoid the mistakes she had made. She never demonstrated any genuine understanding of how her actions had violated the trust and love that had shaped her entire childhood. But sometimes, driving through town, I would catch glimpses of her shopping at expensive stores or dining at trendy restaurants, clearly enjoying the comfortable lifestyle her marketing job and Marcus's investment income provided. She seemed happy, successful, oblivious to the deeper consequences of choices that had damaged the most important relationship in her life. On quiet evenings, I sat in my garden watching the sun set behind the familiar mountains, thinking about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, between love and enabling, between hope and delusion. I had forgiven Charlotte for her choices because carrying anger was exhausting and ultimately self-destructive, but I couldn't reconcile with someone who would never truly acknowledge the harm she had caused or demonstrated genuine change in her values and priorities. The inheritance remained in trust, growing steadily through careful investment and supporting important work that protected vulnerable people from the kind of exploitation I had experienced. Charlotte would receive a portion when she turned 35, assuming she could demonstrate the character development her father had considered essential. But the bulk of Richard's estate would continue funding the foundation's work long after I was gone, creating a legacy of protection and advocacy that seemed far more meaningful than simply transferring wealth to someone who had never earned it. 5 years after their wedding, Charlotte contacted me with surprising news. She was pregnant with her first child and wanted to rebuild our relationship so her daughter could know her great-grandmother. The letter was carefully written, acknowledging some of her past mistakes and expressing hope that we could create a better future for the next generation. She asked if I would consider meeting for lunch to discuss how we might move forward. I responded cautiously, explaining that grandmother relationships weren't accessories to be added when convenient. That meaningful connections required mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine accountability for past hurts. If she wanted her daughter to know me, she would need to demonstrate the values she hoped to pass on to the next generation. We met at a small CF in Black Mountain, neutral territory, where both of us could speak freely without the emotional weight of familiar settings. Charlotte looked older, more serious than she had at her wedding. Impending motherhood had softened some of her sharp edges and added depth to her previously superficial concerns. She apologized for the forgery, for the lies, for the years of silence that had followed our confrontation. She acknowledged that money had corrupted her judgment and damaged the most important relationship in her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. When I asked what she had learned from our experience, her answers remained somewhat surface level, focused more on regret about consequences than understanding of principles. She seemed to regret getting caught and losing access to inheritance money more than she regretted the betrayal of trust and love. We parted cordially, but without complete resolution. I sent appropriate baby gifts and birthday cards over the following years, maintaining polite distance while hoping Charlotte might eventually demonstrate genuine growth and change. 7 years later, she finally did, though it took a devastating personal crisis to catalyze her transformation. Marcus was arrested for embezzling substantial funds from his investment firm, using client accounts to support their expensive lifestyle and gambling habits Charlotte knew nothing about. Suddenly, she found herself dealing with criminal lawyers, frozen assets, court proceedings, and the devastating realization that the man she had trusted with her life had been systematically lying to her for years. She called me late one evening, crying and confused, asking for advice about how to protect her daughter's future, when everything she had counted on was collapsing around her. I listened patiently, offered practical guidance about legal representation and financial protection, and didn't mention the painful irony of the situation. Instead, I suggested she volunteer at the foundation to better understand how financial betrayal affects families and individuals. She started the following week, answering phones and organizing files. Gradually, she began hearing stories from other women who had been manipulated, deceived, and financially abused by people they had trusted completely. For the first time, Charlotte seemed to understand that our family's trauma wasn't unique or personal. It was part of a broader pattern of how money could corrupt relationships, destroy trust, and leave vulnerable people questioning their own judgment and worth. She worked at the foundation for 3 years, gradually taking on more responsibility and demonstrating genuine empathy for the people we served. She used her marketing skills to develop educational materials, organize community workshops, and create support networks for families dealing with inheritance disputes. On her 35th birthday, I revised the trust distribution terms, not simply because of her age, but because of the character growth she would finally demonstrate through consistent actions rather than words. Charlotte would receive a substantial inheritance, but with conditions requiring continued involvement in the foundation's work and ongoing demonstration of the values she had learned to embrace. More importantly, she had earned back something far more valuable than money: the respect and trust of someone who had watched her journey from selfish entitlement to genuine service. The day she signed the new trust documents, we sat in the same dining room where our confrontation had occurred a decade earlier. But this time, all signatures were genuine, all conversations were honest, and the future looked brighter for both of us. Charlotte's daughter Emma, now 12 years old, had started calling me Great-Grandma Dorothy and spending weekends helping in my garden. She was learning to plant herbs and vegetables, to appreciate the satisfaction of nurturing growing things, to understand that the best rewards come from patient, consistent effort. More importantly, she was learning about honesty, responsibility, accountability, and the difference between earning respect and simply expecting it. The foundation continued expanding its reach, now operating in 6 states and helping more than 1,000 families each year navigate the complex intersection of money, love, and family dynamics. What had started as a response to personal betrayal had become a lasting institution that would protect vulnerable people and strengthen families long after I was gone. On my 80th birthday, the staff organized a celebration at our main office. Charlotte gave a speech about how the foundation had taught her the difference between inheriting money and inheriting values, between receiving gifts and earning trust. She thanked me not just for raising her after her parents died, but for refusing to enable her worst impulses when she had lost her way. She said the greatest gift I had given her wasn't financial security, but the opportunity to become someone worthy of trust, respect, and genuine love. As I sat listening to her words, surrounded by staff members and volunteers who would become like family, I thought about Richard and wondered if he would be proud of how his careful planning had ultimately saved not just the inheritance, but our entire family's integrity. The journey from betrayal to reconciliation had taken more than a decade, but it proved that people could change when they faced real consequences for their choices and received consistent support for better decisions. More importantly, it demonstrated that love sometimes requires saying no, setting firm boundaries, and refusing to enable destructive behavior, even when it would be easier to stay quiet and avoid conflict. The Foundation's work continues growing each year, funded by wise stewardship of Richard's inheritance and supported by volunteers who understand firsthand how financial betrayal can tear families apart and how healing is possible when people choose courage over comfort. Charlotte now serves as the Foundation's executive director, using her painful experience to help other families navigate crises with integrity and hope. Her daughter, Emma, has already announced her intention to study law so she can continue the family tradition of protecting people who feel forgotten or invisible. Sometimes, at the end of particularly meaningful days when we have helped someone escape financial abuse or prevented an elderly person from being exploited by relatives, Charlotte looks at me with tears of gratitude and says she finally understands what her father was trying to teach us through the trust structure. That real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the strength of character required to use resources wisely, the wisdom to recognize that some things, dignity, respect, genuine love, can never be inherited, but must always be earned through consistent, honorable choices. If you have ever felt overlooked or dismissed by family members who only valued you for what you could provide, remember that your worth isn't determined by their recognition or appreciation. Sometimes the people who dismiss you as powerless or irrelevant are in for the biggest surprises of their lives. And if you have ever made serious mistakes that damaged relationships with people who loved you, remember that redemption is always possible. But it requires genuine change, demonstrated through actions over time, not just apologies offered during crisis moments. What story resonates most with your own family experiences? Share your thoughts in the comments about love, forgiveness, and finding the strength to stand up for yourself when it matters most. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that explore the complex dynamics of family, money, and the courage it takes to choose integrity over convenience.